And I think for the purposes of a comparison, the best thing to do is to show that 100,000 using the client's existing cheapest fund. So if there wasn't, if they're switching advice but not a new fund, and so in this case, I'm assuming that it would be CBUS, which is probably fairly reasonable. Compare the ongoing costs of the 100,000 in CBUS to the 100,000 in net wealth, and that gives you a like-for-like comparison, applying the advice or the strategy to the products. Some advisors will do it a bit differently and like to have a few different comparisons showing, what if we used all of the existing funds. That's not necessarily the wrong either. It's just that you're having the it's just about having the cost comparison in there. Now, I've had a couple of questions on those, just on the cost comparison, so I'll see if I can answer those. So one question is, why can't we use the total of the current multiple funds? Well, I think, hopefully I've answered that one, but I think having a like-for-like comparison is more realistic, that the clients actually come and they're being recommended that they do consolidate. So it would be a more reasonable comparison to show what would they do if they took up the advice. I guess there is the chance that the client doesn't take up the advice and just walks away, and then it's perhaps not an exact comparison of what they would get if they did use one of their existing super funds to compare to what the recommendations would be. And there's another question of, can you use the average of all three as midwinter allows? So I think what that question's asking is, can you average the cost of the three funds and compare that to the full consolidated amount into the two fund? I'd probably like to see what that looks like in practice, but I think you'd be better off choosing one of the existing funds and putting the whole amount in there rather than the average, because you're going to show, at least choosing the cheapest existing fund, you're going to give the client a maybe, I don't know, what would you say, a worst case scenario, or if they use one of the existing funds, or it might be a best case scenario if they were to stay where they were or use one of their existing funds. There's a good question that that someone's asked that says, in some cases the two fund cost is lower than the from fund. However, when taking into account the ongoing advisor service fee, the ongoing cost to the client will be higher than the current arrangement. How can we demonstrate this? And that's a really good point. What I would certainly say, and this is getting that like-for-like comparison, you've probably got two ways of going about it, but the software that you would use, and if you're doing it manually, the ability to include it manually, really does allow you to include an advisor service fee. And I would say that advisor service fee is going to be not just it's not really for the advice that's being provided here, but for the ongoing services. So regardless of whether the client stays where they are or takes the advice to move, if they take up the ongoing services, then that amount would be applicable. So applying that to the cost comparison would be reasonable, and I would certainly recommend that to show, here are the product costs, and also be aware that there's an advisor service fee on there. Now, you may draw the client's attention to that with a sentence under if you put it in a comparison table or something like that. Alternatively, you could exclude the advisor service fee from both the from and to fund, and then you would disclose that later in your disclosure section to say, as well, putting the product aside, there's also an ongoing advice fee, also ongoing services fee. Both of those options will give you a like-for-like comparison, but definitely if included in one, include it in the other, so that the client sees, if I take up the advice, here will be the full ongoing cost. If I stay where I am, here will be the ongoing costs as well. So I won't go through these examples as well. They're pretty much the same thing along similar lines. But these examples are up on our website as well that you can always have a look at down the track if you need to. So some real life examples, and I think it's always good to go through a few examples of SOAs. And in these cases, I pulled out some ones that we reviewed that we felt weren't as good as they could have been. And I've also explained what revisions we felt were required to address the issues. So in example one here, the investment advice, the client's goals were investment advice on the reinvestment of MLC Navigator Retirement Plan Super Fund, and appropriate investment that offers investment choice to suit a balanced risk profile, which are also cost efficient and flexible for future retirement needs. Probably not exactly using the client's words there, but probably captures them reasonably accurately. In the first draft of the SOA, the advice, the SOA recommended a rollover to net wealth, and many of the net wealth features were used as a basis for advice that were also present in the Navigator Fund. What we saw was the SOA wasn't completely tailored, and we saw probably what I'd say is evidence of some templating of the SOAs, using standard text when it wasn't always applicable to the client. So what it did talk about was the client had also that the advice would provide simple administration, but actually because some of the funds in Navigator were frozen, the client was able to roll out most of their funds, but they ended up for an unforeseen period that they would have 2 super funds running until they could get those frozen funds out. So it really didn't provide simple admin. It probably made it more complex. There was some information about consolidation, consolidating of super funds, where there was only one fund being moved, so there wasn't really any consolidation at all. It linked the managed fund features to the advice delivery. So in this case, it talked about the use of the Core Plus portfolios and stated that they were expected to retain an S&P rating of 3 stars and above going forward. So that, I mean, I suppose that's okay for marketing material from the product provider, but putting it in the SOA, I looked at it and thought, the result or performance there is really outside advisor's control. So you don't want to put something like that in that the client may reasonably or unreasonably hold you to, and it raises their expectations too high. And as I said before, it might be, ASIC considers that it might be misleading to describe a feature of the 2 fund as a benefit of making the switch unless the feature satisfies a client's need or objective and it's not available in the from fund. So, I'd caution or recommend that extreme caution is used when talking about product features, and really stay away from it. So what the revised SOA did was explain the commonality of features, and one of those was that the amount of funds available. So there were similar numbers of managed funds available in both products. So it explained that these were similar. What it drew out better was that the basis for the switch was lower costs, which linked back to the client's need for cost efficiency, and then removed the statement about the expectation to retain S&P's rating, and there was also a comment in there about not expected to lead to future suspended funds. And while that, again, good for the product, easier for the product provider to say it, because